Welcome to the Beyond Crude podcast, episode 12, the last episode of this season. And after this episode, we're going to take a short break. And then when we come back, we'll be coming back on season 2. The last episode, we looked at, we followed the money, discussed a bit about how Total had been able to get funding through bonds. And we were grateful to Antoine from Reclaim Finance, who was able to walk us through that. And of course, our coordinator, this topic of campaign coordinator, Zaki Mamdu, was able to also explain why communities across Africa had decided that they wanted to kick Total out of Africa. So catch up with that episode if you hadn't watched it. Today, I have amazing guests as well. And we are going to pick up from that point about communities mobilizing, communities refusing to be bullied by the fossil fuel industry and refusing the idea that the continent can be locked on a fossil fuel path. So with me is Doreen and Karabo. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. Starting with you, Karabo.
Hi, Abid, and hi to the listeners. My name is Karabo Mukanyana. I convene the Don't Gas Africa campaign, and I work with Power Shift Africa as a campaigner.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Doreen Onyanga, and I'm the campaign coordinator for deCOALonize, which is a movement that is committed to stopping coal industries, extraction, mining, and other fossil fuel initiatives in Kenya and in Africa generally. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Doreen. Thank you, Karabo, for making time for this conversation. Today, we're just going to go deep into the conversation. There's this new campaign. I don't know whether it's right to call it a new campaign, called Draw the Line. So I would want to start with you, Doreen. What does this Draw the Line mean? And can you paint a picture for our listeners of what life is like for the Lamu Fisher folk, where you've been working to support the communities that are asserting their rights and are trying to stop the Lamu coal power plant, and how that proposed plant will change their reality?
All right. So I'll start with a brief background of how Lamu looks like for people who haven't been there, for people who've been there. So Lamu is a historic town located on the coastal northern coast of Kenya. And it's very historical. It's one of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites that is very famous for its architecture, the carved doors, the fact that they've maintained their traditional Swahili culture for over 700 years. So they actually got inscribed as part of the World Heritage Site in 2001 as the oldest and best preserved settlement in East Africa. That is a big deal. And a lot of the community members rely on several activities, but primarily fishing and agriculture. I'm going to talk about the fisher folk. Their livelihood, their culture comes from the sea. You know, they depend on marine life. They depend on the biodiversity of the Indian Ocean, both for their livelihoods and also for their culture. So when we talk about a coal plant that is being proposed to be built there and to process coal that is going to be sourced from another area in Kitui, we're talking about the degradation of their livelihood. We're talking about severe environmental health issues, economic effects. And this is as a result of the projected pollution. We're expecting and anticipating a lot of negative effects, both on human life and both on the sea life. The marine ecosystem is going to be affected. There'll be significant greenhouse gas emissions. And one of the proposed methods of the coal plant's operations is called dredging and wastewater disposal, which will be very detrimental to the ecosystem at the coast. This will affect the mangroves, the grass, the coral reefs, marine life, and the local livelihoods. Apart from fishing, the Lamu community depends a lot on tourism. The reason I talked about them being a World Heritage Site is one of the reasons Lamu has been on the map for years, for almost 20 years, because it is intact, it is well placed, the waters are very clean, they're very clear, they're very blue, the culture, the identity of the people. So when you're talking about a coal plant being in place in Lamu, we are definitely going to see a decline in tourism. People come for sporting activities, fishing activities, diving, marine exploration. All that is definitely going to go down the drain literally as we speak. And then speaking of health issues, it's a definite and it's a known fact that the air pollution is going to contribute to a lot of respiratory issues. There'll be contamination of clean water. There'll be the loss of biodiversity. As we speak already in Kenya, we are having an issue with our healthcare. The government cannot provide the required healthcare for its citizens. So what is going to happen when there's another burden caused by air pollution, water pollution? We're just going to see a decline in health, child mortality, neonatal statistics are going to be on the rise. We're going to see a lot of premature deaths, a lot of proliferation of diseases that primarily are not, let's say, native to that area. We're looking at different cancers. So it's not just a matter of health and economics, but it's also a matter of how all these factors tie in together. And that is why we as decolonize are saying no, because we want to maintain the culture of the people, the fisher folk. What are they supposed to do? So it all ties down, as opposed to looking at the issues in silos, but looking at them in terms of how does the economic affect the culture, their identity as a people, the health of the people, the futures of their children. And that is how we are looking at the whole coal plant affecting the people in Lamu.
Awesome. Thank you for that background. And I want to now move to Karabo. And Karabo, maybe also you could, I know that you work across multiple African regions, and I would love for you to share a compelling story from the front lines that shows how fossil fuel projects are affecting communities across the continent. But also, as you do that, tell us what this Drawing the Line means for you.
Thank you so much. Maybe let me just start with what, Drawing the Line means, because I think that's a bit more, gives a bit of context as to why it is important for community voices, but African voices in this context of this campaign to really, be heard. So Draw the Line is basically a global week of action. It's a campaign, and it's organized by various coalitions of, civil society movements, NGOs. We're basically all coming together. And the idea is to unite people around the world to protest against injustices, pollution, fossil fuel expansion, inequality, and climate damage. And really for us to demand a, just transition, even just expansion to, equality, clean energy access, rights, human rights protection, jobs, democracy, and fairness. We just really want to have a conversation on justice in relation to, the climate conversation. And why this is so relevant and timely is because of a lot of things that are happening. And, on the continent, we are having conversations on, fossil fuels and just the energy conversation. So in terms of my line of work, one of the story that really stays with me is from Cabo Delgado in northern Mozambique. So communities there were really promised jobs and development when multinational companies came in to exploit gas reserves. And I'm going to speak about gas specifically. Instead, what many, of them experienced was displacement from their ancestral lands, increased insecurity, and a cost of living that became so high that the locals could no longer even afford, basic living. So, and then women in particular would carry the burden. So there's even an intersectional impact to this whole thing. And women would have to walk longer distances, to fetch water and firewood because of restricted access to land. So what was sold as development actually deepened poverty, inequality, and even conflict. And I think a lot of the conversation on Cabo Delgado is mainstreamed around conflict, all caused by fossil fuels. And this is not unique to Mozambique. So we see similar patterns, for the East African crude oil pipeline. We see it in the Niger Delta, and we even see it in, the South Africa's coal belt. So fossil fuel projects often extract wealth for corporations and elites while leaving a lot of ordinary Africans worse off. So we really need to have conversations and speak truth to this aspect of fossil fuel projects and what they're doing to communities across the continent.
Thank you for also helping us understand better what the Draw the Line campaign is all about. And I think that's a good point to also get you, Doreen, to help us understand at what specific moment did the community in Lamu and potentially even in Kitui, where coal is supposed to be mined, at what point did they decide that they're going to participate in this Draw the Line project?
A pivotal moment was when the court first revoked the power plant's license. This happened in 2019 when there was the tribunal that actually revoked the license based on lack of participation. They cited that there was not proper an ESIA done, and the fact that the community was not involved in this. There was just staged and very fake community consultations that happened. Therefore, the community members are also not informed about some of these projects that are being proposed. Then there's also a total ignoring and negligence when it came to addressing some of the perceived and anticipated impacts, like on the people's health, flora, fauna. So the tribunal actually said, you know what, we are going to revoke this license, and we are going to have to redo and relook at this process. Like, at what point was the investor very confident that this project was going to take place? And there was a false sense of lull after that, because it was celebrated as a win in terms of, okay, so the license has been revoked. Chances are this project is not going to take place. However, last year, there was a revival of the undoing of the revocation. So there's an ongoing appeal by the investors who want to continue with the project. And this was when the community members were like, wait a minute, what happened? There were certain conditions that had been set aside and set by the court in terms of before this exploration and before the proposed coal plant is to be constructed and before anything was to happen. There was a set of rules and regulations that were supposed to take place. Nothing has happened. The community voices are still very strong. They're saying no. There was a lot of incitement, especially by people in power, the county government, with the false promises that, oh, you know what, once this coal plant is up and running, you're going to get a lot of opportunities. The youth will not struggle looking for work. It's actually going to be good for you. However, due to a lot of advocacy and just a lot of awareness creation and legal mitigative strategies that were put in place by some of our legal partners, the community members were still not convinced, and they want their voices included. They want their thoughts, they want their opinions on the plant taken into consideration. Of course, there's a few community members who are swayed in terms of leading others and telling them, you know what, the government is right. This is what we need. The economy is not strong right now. We need to do A, B, C, D. Let's just let them in so that we can kickstart this. And this actually resulted in a lot of the community members being displaced. There's people who've lost their ancestral land. They're literally homeless. They've lost aspects of their culture. They have been displaced, and they are living in places where they never envisioned themselves to be living. There's people who also have lost their sources of income. For example, agriculture. If you are planting, if you're harvesting, you depend on that as a family. That's your livelihood. Therefore, the community members have also seen, in Lamu particularly, that these are all just false promises. And then this was the point where there's a strong realization that, you know what, as a community, we have to have a sense of purpose, and we cannot do this individually, but we have to come together. And this is what also Draw the Line is about, bringing people together to drive purpose, to drive change, to bring in aspects of sustainability amongst different stakeholders. And with special emphasis being on, the marginalized, the vulnerable populations, the women. Karabo mentioned intersectionalism, and there's intersectional feminism when it comes to addressing climate justice, climate issues. What about tolerance? What happens to rule of law? What happens to, commitment to human rights, integrity? So these are some of the things that have been very pivotal, especially in addressing the fact that when communities come together, you can actually say no. to such proposed plans. And as we speak, we are waiting the court's ruling, which is going to be on the 30th of this month. And it is our hope, our prayer, our belief that, for once, like, let it be a precedence. Let the court set a precedence when it comes to addressing the community's concerns when it comes to climate justice issues, climate rights, women's rights, as opposed to just dishing out and giving out licenses to people who are promising the world, but at the end of it, what are you going to get? A lot of nothing. So that was a very pivotal moment for us.
Thank you so much. And we're going to keep tabs on the upcoming ruling. And like you say, we are also hoping that the community will once again get rejoiced. And I think you say something that is quite important to note, that sometimes 2019 is a long time ago to think that the case was over and done with. And then the appeal comes up suddenly when the community is least suspecting. And so I understand how that would be a good point for communities to mobilize themselves for this draw the line. And on that note, actually, because you did mention that there are some communities that were swayed in and they're thinking that perhaps they're being left behind and that they need development, I would want now to ask you, Karabo, how do you respond to the narrative that Africa needs gas for development, particularly because it's being considered as a transition fuel? And what does the evidence from communities actually tell you?
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, we've really heard this argument quite a lot, that Africa needs gas for development, Africa needs fossil fuels holistically for development. And this argument for me is really a recycled myth, mainly pushed by fossil fuel companies and political leaders on the continent. The reality is that Africa has been, I'm going to place emphasis on this word, has been exporting, oil and gas for over a century, for over half a century. And I'm placing emphasis on the exporting bit because it plays such a big part. Because then it results in half of our population, which is over 600 million people, still living without access to reliable electricity. So if fossil fuels were truly the path to development, as positioned, Africa would already be thriving, but we're exporting everything to the global north, and it's sold back to us at very high costing, and we can't even afford this very oil and gas that comes from our very continent. So is it really developing, our continent, or is it really locking us into, stranded assets? Is it locking us into fossil fuels that are currently just not benefiting us? And right now it's just looking like exploitation and extractivism at its best for the benefit of other continents. And for just in the context of, what the evidence says, for communities really, when we engage them, communities tell us that, gas projects obviously tend to, displace them, pollute their water, and lock governments into debt. So there's also a debt aspect to the gas and oil industry that we're not seeing, because there's also an aspect of exchange rates where we're selling these in our own local currencies. They're sold back to us in, US dollars, euros, pounds, which is the reason why we really can't afford these specific things. And just those kind of power dynamics really make it difficult. It's not just impacting our governments and political leaders who are making these decisions. It's really impacting our communities. And that's why we are still seeing this trend of, a big number of people not having access to electricity or clean cooking on this continent. And a lot of the electricity then is exported or used for industry. So we're also seeing a bit more of a bigger shift towards industry, electrification, and we still have communities that don't have this electrification. So we don't have electrification for households in the way that we're supposed to be seeing. The evidence basically points to another direction. It basically is saying decentralized renewable energy projects, things like solar mini grids and wind farms, are delivering the kind of energy we need that is really accessing communities and powering households. And these kind of systems, as we see them, being implemented across the continent in various communities, are really powering, not only just the households, so schools, health clinics, faster and cheaper than gas and oil or any other fossil fuel. But it's also super accessible once deployed. So development in Africa is really about access, affordability, and sovereignty over the energy that we have. And fossil fuels is not allowing us to have that energy sovereignty. It's really just allowing us to have these extractive models of the past, and we want to move away from that. We really want to develop as a continent, and the fossil fuels are not developing us at all. We are still in the dark, and as long as we continue with these resources, we will continue being in the dark, we will continue being exploited, and we will continue with these extractive models that we are seeing on the continent.
Thank you so much. What you've mentioned about exporting, the role Africa has been playing in this has always been exporting energy in its raw form, be it gas, be it crude oil, and that it does not meet any immediate needs, energy needs of the country. And I think this is the same case I've had with even the East African crude oil pipeline, that the proponents are talking about Uganda needing energy, helping them, but at the end of the day, it's just being taken off to the global market. But with the Lamu coal power plant, it's slightly different, because this was supposed to apparently meet the energy needs within the country. Although now the communities there were opposing it for reasons that Doreen has explained around their heritage, their health, their marine life, of course, the livelihood, as is the case with every fossil fuel company, or rather fossil fuel project. So, Doreen, I was interested to know, so what have been your biggest challenges that you've faced in resisting this coal plant? And even as you respond to that, I also want you to tell me how the community in Lamu is connecting with the broader continental Draw the Line movement.
All right. So one of the greatest challenge we've had is generally as a country, we have a very shrinking civic space. So this has led to a lot of ills being done, a lot of rules being broken, a lot of neglect and negligence when it comes to adherence to the Constitution. Because the Constitution, for example, allows freedom of expression, freedom of association. However, with the current regime that we are under, it's become more and more difficult for people to express dissent when it comes to any issue, particularly any projects, or be they infrastructural or the so-called development projects that are supposed to be in the communities. When the community doesn't agree with the government or government officials, then there's a big problem. And this has resulted in a lot of harassment of some of the key activists in both Lamu and Kitui. There have been arrests, there have been false charges put against them, there's been imprisonment. Actually, it's more of detention. And then with threats of being imprisoned, there's been harassment of family members. We've had cases where people's children are actually being harassed while they're in boarding school. They know that a certain activist is very vocal, and they say, you know what, you might operate under this this wing of this movement. However, your kids are not under the wing, therefore they're very vulnerable. So that has been one of the key factors. Before, it used to be like more verbal, and a few police officers, law enforcement sent to threaten people, but it's actually turned violent, And then a second, one of the other challenges has been there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation online, and it's usually gendered to the point where when you're being harassed as an activist or a human rights defender, they target the women. Kenya is very patriarchal. We know that women have to fight for their space, women have to fight to be heard, women have to fight for their voices to even be taken into consideration. And this cuts across all classes. We've seen political representatives, be they members of parliament, be they senators, who are actually being harassed. And there's a lot of trolling and doxing and online attacks that are levied against them. So how about the person who's a community member, who is either a community champion or an activist? They are getting like really, really attacked. There's misinfo, there's gendered attacks where people spread rumors about you. They know your family life. You come from a very cultural, like Lamu is very cultural. The women who are operating in this space have the go ahead of the husbands to do so because the husbands tend to be more liberal. However, when there's an coordinated attack against a certain individual, citing sexual misbehavior, so to speak, improprieties, it tends to ruin the family life. It portrays them in such a negative light to even other people in their families, their in-laws. Like your mother-in-law comes across an article that says, "Oh, you're only doing this because there's this person in power who you're having a relationship with." It's been really bad. So we are yet to come up with like sort of definitive ways of addressing the misinfo and the disinfo, and also a lot of malinformation narratives that are online. This has also impacted the nation's perspective when it comes to fossil fuel exploration, in this case, coal. There's people who totally believe we are being funded by the West, and that is the reason we are saying no to coal. And the common narrative that is spread online is the West developed on fossil fuels. Who are we to say no? Is it that they want Africa? Is it that they want Kenya to remain backwards? What is, how do you respond to that? Because they've also done their research and they can see the funders are not secret funders, and most of them are funders from the West. This also talks about following the money. So it just comes out and it really does appear as if it's a paid agenda. So to address some of these things, we're just trying to come up with coordinated responses, talking to people in different sectors, different thematic areas, not just making it an environmental issue, but it's a national issue. It's a human rights issue. Like, can we get people in the health sector on board? Can we get people who are in the democracy sector, governance? Because it all plays a part as to how we address some of these challenges. And then, so how the work has connected with the broader draw the line. Communities are the bedrock. Communities are the front line when it comes to achieving anything. Communities actually underpin our humanity as a people. Without community, there's actually no purpose. Community is what drives us. And that is what we connect to when we talk about, like Lamu, the Lamu community connecting with Draw the Line. There's been so many lessons, like best practices, case studies. How has this been done in other places? There's no need to reinvent the wheel. We can actually borrow as Kenyans from other countries, South Africa being one of them in Africa, Mozambique, Nigeria. What has been the impact of fossil fuels? We've seen nothing but strife. We've seen nothing but degradation of human life. There's been a proliferation of sexual and gender-based violence. There's been, a lot of exploitation, a lot of negativity that stemmed from fossil fuel exploration. There's been promises of, electricity is going to cost lower. And that is also a narrative that is being spread when you talk about misinformation. They say the power prices, the electricity is so expensive right now. The reason people can't afford it is because we're not exploring other sources. But is that really the case? Like, can we have studies that have been done elsewhere that actually show that this is not the case? There's nothing that is going to come out of this that will positively impact the community. We've also looked at solidifying our networks with other similar campaigns, like Dongas Africa, there's Stop ECOP, there's the Africa movements, there's Africa VUCA, as deCOALonize, so that we link these struggles. Otherwise, it just looks like everybody is in their own little corner fighting for whatever they're fighting for. However, all these struggles are linked. When you're saying no to fossil fuel, we're saying no to fossil fuel. It can be, it can be coal related, it can be gas related. We cannot just operate in silos. So that is how our work has connected, especially through collaboration and also trying to get other people on board, people who are not necessarily climate justice activists, but just human rights activists, because it's a human rights issue.
Thank you so much for that. There's a lot to unpack from what you said. I mean, the idea that people's children can be targeted is diabolical. It's unbelievable that project proponents can sink this low in a bid to just undermine community actions. And you're also very spot on the misinformation. I think one of the things the pro-fossil fuel or big oil have done very well is to control the narrative, continuously calling people and communities who are trying to, ask for what is good for them, that they are anti-development. And I think you've done a good job of explaining how this is something that we need to all tackle together. And also that the community is a bedrock is really powerful in the sense that we cannot just do all these things in our little corners. Based on some of the things you've said, that I'm still really, they're still percolating in my head. I can't believe all these things that are happening, and particularly how women are affected disproportionately. And so, Karabo, I would want you to explain for us what is energy justice. And maybe before you talk about that energy justice, are you also seeing similar patterns of what Doreen is saying in your area of work? And how would you situate that in the context of energy justice?
Yeah, I mean, I was equally really moved by, the scenarios that Doreen has painted. We have 100% seen some of the worst things, whether it's in the Niger Delta in terms of oil, whether it's in Cabo Delgado when it comes to gas, and even in some of the coal communities in Mpumalanga and South Africa, just the human rights violations are excessive. And it's like, a lot of the pro fossil fuel, whether it's corporations doing it or the political leadership doing it, I don't know, there's a level of cruelty that they will do anything and, eliminate anybody who's standing in their way. And that's a big, big, big problem. Um, and just then to contextualize it with energy justice, which is something we truly want. And ultimately, that's something we're fighting for, at the back end of all these different human rights violations and abuses that we see. So, energy justice is really about fairness, It's all about making sure that everyone, and not just these corporations or political leadership, or even just wealthy and, urban elites, have access to clean, affordable, and reliable energy. So it is about really accessing that energy component. But it's also about how that energy is produced, because sometimes we just talk about the access bit. It's also really about just the value chain and how it is produced. So are communities consulted before projects begin? Do they benefit from jobs, revenues, and better services? Or are they displaced and left in the dark, while these companies profit? And even most of the time, these profits flow to, the global north, or just flow abroad. And for Africa's future, energy justice is quite central. So it's very important for us to contextualize energy justice being central because of, one, our history, and because we are at a crossroads. So we can either lock ourselves into another century of dependence on, polluting, extractive fossil fuels, or we can build an energy system that is people-centered, that is renewable, and that is inclusive. So energy justice makes sure that the transition we're talking about, or even leapfrogging we're talking about, is not just green, but is also fair and is empowering for communities, but it's also very intersectional. It does take into consideration the intersectional needs of women in this conversation, of youth, of indigenous communities who tend to really suffer, in terms of a lot of the violations we see. It's really about people and ensuring that people feel seen. And energy justice makes sure and contextualizes this conversation of, who is seen, who is heard, who is supported, who gets access to these things. And it mainstreams that, and it makes sure that every single voice, as different as it is, really is represented and does get access to that. But in the process is not also harmed by these, fossil fuels. We're then getting rid of anything that is then harming them. And yeah, energy justice is really about fairness and seeing people.
Thank you, Karabo, for that. And I would still want to stay with you just for a moment, because when you talk about people need to be seen, and I think there's a linkage there between energy justice and sovereignty. It's not just about accessing the energy, but that the communities also need autonomy to control their own energy sources. Yeah. So with that in mind, what will the just transition look like for African communities, and how can it maintain energy sovereignty in that sense?
Yeah, so and it's so important. The sovereignty piece is crucial for the continent, again, because of our history, because of where we are sitting. We are currently suppliers in the value chain, we are suppliers to the rest of the world. So a just transition in Africa really is about moving away, from fossil fuels, but in a way that protects workers, uplifts communities, but also prioritizes the needs of, ordinary people over corporations, or political leaders benefiting from these kind of systems. So it's not about just swapping coal or just fossil fuels generally into clean energy systems like solar and wind. It's about creating decent jobs in renewable industries or green industries holistically, ensuring women and youth and indigenous communities have equal opportunities. And these are, just a speck of marginalized communities. There's persons with disabilities, there's all rural-based communities, there's all these different, marginalized groupings. But also making sure that communities are decision makers and not bystanders. And that's where the autonomy component comes in. So energy sovereignty is very key in this conversation on just transition. So we cannot repeat the cycles where resources are structured and exported, or resources don't really benefit the communities, and leaving people in the dark, in essence. A just transition would have to make sure that communities generate, own, and control this energy systems that we're talking about, whether that's through, local solar grids or cooperatives or regional power sharing. We really need to model just transitions around this conversation on ownership, of control, of the role that, communities play, not just as recipients of this energy that we're transitioning to. Communities need to play an active role. And that's how we will make sure that, Africa doesn't just power homes, but we are powering dignity and independence. And that's crucial for us. It's really not just about getting the lights on or getting the stove on. It's really a dignity and independence conversation as well. It's deeper for us on this continent. And it's important for us to understand that our concept of just transition cannot look like the rest of the world. Our concept of just transition has to mainstream, energy sovereignty, because of that dignity and independence that we need, and autonomy to own and shape what a just transition actually should look like, on the African continent.
Based on what you've just said about African continent having a very different form of just transition from the rest, and how key it is, and connecting it with autonomy, I wonder, Doreen, that would really need a lot of strategic organizing to be able to articulate our demands clearly about what we think a just transition is. And so on that basis, what lessons from you organizing can other African communities who are facing similar projects learn from? And also, for those who are listening to this podcast, who might think that things like coal bring development, what would you tell them about what you've actually witnessed in your community?
All right. So before we can even think and talk about organizing and organizing for impact, we need to know what we're organizing for. And this stems from the fact that people need to be aware of their rights. That is the first thing. You mentioned sovereignty, Karabo. Sovereignty is very important. It's actually Article 1 of the Kenyan Constitution that vests sovereignty in the people. And this was a very key phrase when we were protesting, when we went through the recent protests against the finance bill in Kenya, where we said the people shall. Sovereignty lies with the people. This is the basis to galvanize any grassroots resistance. People have to acknowledge, people have to be aware that their voices count. Their interests have to be covered. What is it that can bind people together? It's common purpose. So when we're talking about lessons learned, one, do we know what we're organizing for? Are we just organizing because somebody came from somewhere else and told us, you guys have a problem? Or do we ourselves recognize that there's a problem or an issue or a gap that needs to be addressed? Contextualization of issues is also very important. It's very hard to organize in a community that has absolutely nothing, because everybody tends to look at things through as a different lens. So it's going to be short-term thinking. So I come to, let's say, Lamu, and I say, I'm going to bring jobs and I'm going to make sure your power costs are low. For people who are in business, you're going to pay lesser tax because this and this is going to happen. Of course, if they have nothing, then they're going to go with the flow. They're going to say, oh yeah, Doreen is the savior. But am I really, or have I taken the opportunity to exploit the need? So as organizers, we have to be cognizant of the situational analysis that exists in different contexts. We cannot employ the same methodology in Kitui when you're undertaking community organizing as we will in Lamu or as we will in any other part of Kenya. We have to know, is it an economic issue? Is it a health issue? At the end of the day, in my experience and working in this project, what people want is a good life. People want some level of dignity, some level of respect, some level of compassion. That has been like the common factor across people from different backgrounds. How do we ensure as organizers that that is taken into consideration? I don't think anybody in their right mind will agree to a project that threatens the livelihoods of their, let's say, spouse or their own, or that will take away years from the children's life. If you're told your child's mortality rate is going to drop or is going to increase, how will that affect you? You'll have to ask questions. Context matters, vocabulary, language matters. We as organizers, we have to be very, very clear and very careful with the language we use and the vocabulary we use, because a common problem and mistake that we make is we go to the communities and we use all these big words, and Karabo, I love how you explain just transition, energy access. Most people will not understand what a just transition is until you explain it to them in the local language and the vocabulary that they'll understand, in terms of this is what it means for you, this is what it means for your family, your community members, your future kids, your future grandchildren. Vocabulary and context are very important. Another thing that we need to do is be more strategic in terms of combating issues to do with misinformation, disinformation. People who are pro these projects are usually very well coordinated. They have the messaging on point. They know the target audience. They know what language to use. They know what context that they will use to rope you in. But meanwhile, we tend to not have it as together, because you'll find someone is working on advocacy, but they're just working on the advocacy angle alone. It's very important to have a strategic alliance. We input things like community mobilization, digital organizing, policy engagement, legal interventions. How do these all come together? How do we make better use of the resources that we have so that we can actually see something? And I'd like to also mention the whole accountability framework. We as deCOALonize have targeted county leaders, we've targeted governors at the county level. We are holding them responsible. We have marched, we have had solidarity marches, we've had peaceful protests where we tell them to please declare your stand. What is your stand on the mining in Kitui? What is your stand on the displacement of people that is happening as a result of the mining in Kitui? In Lamu, we have done the same. We go to the county assembly members and we say, you need to declare your stand, because that holds them accountable. They cannot backtrack as easily as they would if we just target them as a group. It has to be personalized. It has to be personal messages. It has to be a personal engagement with some of these politicians, because it has a bearing. It has a bearing on their track record. Come the next election, as they're always looking forward to the next election, they have to stand by what they said. They have to say, okay, I said no to coal, however, I did A, B, C, D. Or if I said yes to coal, why did I say it? So they have to start backtracking. It also takes away their power. Lastly, I think there's a need to not only just say it, but also really involve the community. Yeah, involve the community, make sure that their voices do matter. We have COP right now. I mean, people just came from ACS. We have the New York Climate Week that's coming up end of this month. We have COP30 coming up. how many people are actually going to be there who are from the community? How many women are going to be there? How many indigenous community members are going to be there? Are we going to have the same faces last year, this year, next year, talking about the same issues? Is there some level of structure that is in place to actually involve them directly, not just gather their voices and then go and present them or go and project them when we are the ones who get the chance and opportunity to go for some of these events? So I think we really need to walk the walk and talk the talk, not just walk and talk, but we need to walk the talk. We need to be committed. So those are some of the lessons when it comes to organizing. We really do have to say something and mean it.
Thank you so much, Doreen. The gap you're describing between what communities actually experience and what governments promise sounds like exactly the kind of disconnect that needs to be addressed at policy levels. And I'm just happy that Karabo, you were at the Africa Climate Summit that ended yesterday, where these energy decisions are being shaped. What are you hoping to bring from stories like this Doreen is talking about?
Yeah, thank you so much. So, I mean, and I'm glad that Doreen did mention, spaces like and platforms like the Africa Climate Summit, but also just COP in general. And she's right in saying that, these kind of stories and realities are not really reflected in some of these spaces. You do tend to see the same faces. You do tend to really hear the same voices. But I think what is quite refreshing about this specific summit is that I think civil society was quite powerful in terms of, bringing to light some of these realities and some of these stories. And that's the role that a lot of us need to play, because the reality is that the chances of getting everybody into those kind of spaces is very low. It's either because they're costly, but also quite inaccessible. But how do we utilize these spaces to amplify voices, to tell stories, to bring these narratives in these spaces, to shape however it is that we are moving, this discourse on the climate agenda on the continent, but also the energy agenda on the continent. So the summit in itself, and through I've seen in various like side events, there'd be those kinds of things where it's a reflection on what's happening on the ground. There's conversations about that. Unfortunately, because the summit was also kind of hosted in a country where it's quite hard to be outright and have actions and have those kind of momentums. There's also a bit of, aspects of how much can we really speak out. But I also think that shouldn't also be a reason why we don't. I still think we should be out there. We should amplify these kind of realities, and we should utilize it to really influence how it is that, decisions are made. And it kind of brings me also just to just the relevance of the Draw the Line campaign to, these kind of spaces. So we utilize those kind of campaigns as well to connect directly around, putting fossil fuels down, but also connecting the dots in terms of the continuation of fossil fuel investment basically undermines and contradicts some of the priorities that we see amplified in spaces like the Africa Climate Summit. So the summit in itself, there was a lot of conversation on climate finance, energy access, but linking that to also conversations on Africa's development priorities. So how do we bring the conversation on Africa's development priorities while shedding the light that the continued, support of fossil fuels looks like this in our communities, and it's not advancing African development priorities, the very priorities your summits are trying to push. So it's so important. And I think one of the things I'm a really big fan of is storytelling. How do we bring these stories into these spaces? And it's something that is important for, our various movements, campaigns, and organizations to basically do.
Thanks, Karabo. I think you painted a very powerful narrative about countering these massive corporate interests, and especially the point about organized people, being able to beat organized money. So to paraphrase what you just said, Doreen, you've been doing exactly that in Lamu, and I understand your resistance has inspired other communities. So can you tell us how your fight has influenced other coal projects across Kenya and East Africa? And particularly, briefly, just what role women have played in your community's resistance efforts?
Okay. So, previously, the coal plants, there was talks of the coal plant being taken to Kilifi because the basis of having the coal plant along the coastline is because they need a lot of water to cool the systems. And that is it has a direct correlation on the sea life. So it's just a cycle. So they need the water, they take the water, use it, and then they put it back in the ocean, but it's going to raise the temperature of the ocean, leading to marine life being destroyed, fish dying, the full cycle. So as a result of the Lamu community coming out so strongly and saying no to coal, no to the coal plant, other communities along the coastline have also said no. There's been talks about a nuclear station being set up in Kilifi, which is also along the Kenyan coastline, which was also the original proposed project for the coal plant. And right now, as we speak, the community members have been up in arms. They continue being up in arms, saying no to those projects because they are not benefiting at all. And it's ironic that they keep picking Kilifi because it has an open coastline. But it's ironic in that Kilifi has one of the least performing indicators when it comes to health. They have the highest rate of child stunting, highest rate of malnourishment. They have the highest rate of nutritional deficiencies amongst pregnant women, highest rate of anemia, highest rate of sickle cell. So already they are struggling as a county. There's a lot of issues, a lot of problems. There's a lot of disparity between the rich and the poor. And here comes several investors wanting to literally add oil to the fire. They have learned to say no. They have seen the Lamu community, if they can say no, because previously the Lamu community was very understated in terms of the literacy levels are not that high. People were like, you know what, Lamu will accept because they need the economic opportunities. They're very cultural. They don't really undergo formal education. But a lot of that has changed. The people are empowered. The people have such high awareness levels that it actually is impressive and it has inspired a lot of community members. So we're looking at it that way in terms of if they can say no, the people whom the government thought would be a walkover community, what about the rest who actually boast of higher levels of education and literacy and health outcomes? So that is one way. Women in Lamu have been very traditional in the upbringing, very traditional, even when they get married, and it's generational. So there's been a lot of like the proper, there's a word that goes around or a phrase where they say they're proper women in that they have delegated most of the decision making to the men. They take care of their home, homemakers, they're nurturers. That has not stopped them from speaking out. Yes, they are very respectful of their culture. They understand that the system is very patriarchal. However, their voices have fueled this fight against coal. They have been taken seriously. They have formed feminist circles where they create safe spaces to express themselves, talk about their issues, see how best to escalate issues, even to the policy level. Right now, the women in Lamu have been at the forefront of fighting for gender perspectives to be included in climate change policies. So when other communities see this, they really do get inspired. They see that is women's voices at work, action at work. And that is what we'd urge others. Like when something is working, when you have a best practice, it's good to share. And finally, Karabo mentioned storytelling. Storytelling is very powerful. This is how we have managed to keep the movement going, even after the false win, through storytelling, capturing people's voices, images, humanizing our efforts, humanizing their concerns, and actually just ensuring that it is them, they're telling it from their perspective without influence, without coaching. It is from them and their context, and they're speaking to the rest of the world.
Thank you so much. That's a good point to end. Karabo, Doreen, I can't thank you enough for joining us. We can say that season 1 is a wrap. Next time we'll be coming on, we'll be on season 2. And I think we'll take a short break before we come back for the next season, looking more vibrant and with more stories about the fossil fuel industry and how communities are claiming their space and pushing for energy sovereignty. Thank you, Karabo and Doreen.